Ibrahim and his son Ishmael were guided by God to a place where they would be instructed to build a house. This would not be any ordinary house, but one devoted to the worship of God, and one built for God as a representation of his divine power on earth. This house would be called the Kaaba. As humans left Africa, Saudi Arabia was one of the earliest destinations, as, despite what we think of the lands today, the Arabian desert was more of a savanna, more hospitable to the early migrating humans. These humans migrated from Egypt in the north, and the Horn of Africa in the south. In the south, the Almagar Civilization formed, with clear evidence of widespread agriculture and the domestication of horses. This was one of the most advanced civilizations of the time, but their advancement was brought to a halt as the desertification of the Arabian Peninsula began. Rivers began to dry, and most vegetation and fauna were centralized around small oases, destroying the Almagar Civilization, as the lands could no longer support their population size, farming practices, and stationary lifestyle. Pastoral nomads took their place in the region, as groups of people who led their livestock from pasture to pasture in regular intervals. For a time, this is all we saw from Saudi Arabia, an arid land of herders without the capability for large civilizations to grow. But as other civilizations arose all around Saudi Arabia, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, to the Indus Valley, to Punt, trade routes became the main source of wealth for the local people. To facilitate this trade, cities and trade posts began to form throughout Saudi Arabia, and these new stationary peoples were able to create the Dilmun civilization, as pack animals at the time had yet to have been selectively bred to make them as strong or as large as ours today. For Mesopotamia to trade with the Indus Valley civilization, or Magan, it was much easier to transport cargo by sea. This meant trade in the Persian Gulf increased, and so did the wealth of local Saudi Arabian cities, which were part of the small but wealthy Dilmun civilization. Initially, the epicenter for this civilization was around Tarut Island, but eventually this was shifted to Bahrain. However, controlling the trade routes of this region was very appealing to foreign powers. So, beginning with the Sealand dynasty of Babylonia conquering this coast, the lands of Dilmun were under many successive foreign rulers. But the turmoil for Dilmun didn't end there, as with many expensive goods at sea, came pirates. And with this sudden spike in piracy, the wealth and power of sea trade began to falter and decline. But during this period, camels were domesticated, making living and trading through the Arabian desert much more manageable and appealing. We now see a tribal confederacy arise in northwestern Arabia, called Midian, which is mentioned in the Bible. Midian was ruled by 5 kings, Eki, Zur, Hur, Reba, and Rechem, which is why the title of tribal confederacy is placed on Midian, but it isn't sure whether this was actually the Midian's political structure. It is also possible that these kings were meant to represent 5 major Midian settlements, or centers of power. But either way, the Israelites declared war on the Midianites, where they killed all of the men, women, and boys. Around the same time, the Arab people began to migrate and intermarry into Saudi Arabian tribes throughout the peninsula, from somewhere along the Hijazi coast, finally making this peninsula truly Arabian. Soon the Neo-Babylonians marched from the east to claim sovereignty over the lucrative trade routes. Just south of the empire's borders formed the Dedan kingdom, as their expansive wealth from their position on trade routes allowed for them to expand their power beyond their capital city of Dedan. It especially helped that when the Achaemenid Empire conquered the Babylonians, they lost control of the lands in northern Arabia, which allowed for the Dedan to fill this power vacuum. The Dedanites eventually expanded their power beyond mere land routes by securing the Hejaz coastline along the Red Sea. In the deserts, the Nabatean people flourished as nomads. But eventually things changed, as a group of people under the Achaemenids in the north began a rebellion. But these people were defeated, and were mostly killed or banished from their homelands. The Nabateans settled and prospered from trade in these newly emptied lands, but they held a very attractive position to foreign powers due to this trade. So, during the expansion of the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great, a raid was sent out against the Nabateans. Due to their accustomation to the region, the Nabateans could use it to their advantage, by starving out the Greek army as they hid in the desert. This was the last time Alexander's forces attacked the region, but when he passed on, and his empire was divided, Antigonus, who controlled the Levant, wanted the Nabatean lands for his own, and so he attacked these people during a sacred festival of theirs. During this festival, Nabatean women and children were left alone at a certain location. So, this is where the Greeks attacked, initially killing many of these unarmed civilians. The Nabatean men heard of this atrocity, and that night, their warriors caught up with the Greek army and slaughtered most of their men in their sleep. Now, several outposts were built by the Nabateans in preparation for another Greek attack, which soon came and was soon defeated, marking the last attempt by Antigonus to invade these lands. Following this, the Nabateans wanted to expand their power, so invaded the tribes to the northwest and attacked the Dedanites to the south. The ensuing campaign resulted in the downfall of the Dedanites and the power of the Nabateans being unmatched in the region. This power was eventually centralized, and a kingship was established, which historians consider the first Arab kingdom of the region. Nabateans held significant control over the Judeans, as most trade routes going into Judea entered from Nabatea. So, to try and free themselves, the Judeans attacked. The defending Nabateans quickly repelled this army, and brought Judea further under their thumb. Soon after, the Seleucids to the north attacked, feeling their trade power threatened. But, once again, Nabatea properly defended themselves by killing the Seleucid king in the campaigns and destroying the Seleucid army. The Nabatean king at the time, Obodas I, was revered as a god after defending the nation from these invaders. However, this nation found it could not stand against the Romans, and as the Nabatean army fell, the nation became a Roman client state, where their power and wealth stagnated. Eventually, the Nabateans would be officially annexed by the Romans, but it is not understood why this happened now rather than before. What we do know is that they had to be militarily subdued before they gave away their sliver of independence. Under the Romans, the Nabateans lost much of their trade power, with the opening of many new trade routes, and they became less focused on war. Nabatean lands further south, that are now Saudi Arabia, were fairly neglected, and eventually became fringe to the point where they were basically no longer part of the Roman Empire. Further east, the Lakhmid people of the Banu Lakhm tribe emigrated from Yemen, and their leader, Imru al-Qais, wanted an Arab kingdom. This vision of an independent Arab kingdom began several conflicts between the Banu Lakhm and local tribes. These humble beginnings started along the Persian Gulf, where the Lakhmid people founded a strong navy that they used to defend trade routes and raid the Sasanians across the Gulf. But eventually, they expanded further inland. At the time, the Sasanians were in the midst of a civil war, so the Lakhmids were not threatened by retaliation for their raids. But once the internal conflict was solved, the Sasanians turned their focus to these Arabians, who had been causing them so much trouble throughout their turmoil. A war was declared, and the Lakhmids were unable to defend themselves against the massive Sasanian army, and the lands for a time would be a key vassal to the Sasanians in their wars and proxy wars against the Romans. The Lakhmid remained under the Sasanians, and would eventually be annexed officially into the empire. To the benefit of the Sasanians and the Arabs, piracy began being more and more rampant at sea. So, there was an increase in land-based trade routes. This began a prosperous period, where many trading cities in Arabia gained wealth and increased in power, the most important of these cities being Mecca. Even before the advent of Islam, Mecca was a major religious center, where once a year, tribes from all over the region would come to praise their gods. This is a fantastic feat, as, due to the nature of the region, the local tribes were constantly at war, trying to secure power over caravan routes. But, for this same period of time every year, truces would be called so pilgrimages could be made to Mecca. Mecca would be the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, who, later in his life, would be chased from Mecca for promoting his new religion, Islam. From Mecca, Muhammad fled to the nearby city of Medina, another prosperous trade hub, and was declared the leader of the city and its army. Muhammad used this army to raid the caravans of Mecca, as he and the followers he had gained in Mecca sought revenge for their poor treatment by the Meccans. This aggressive behavior led to the local tribes on several occasions uniting an army to try and destroy these Muslim people. But the fact that Muhammad was never able to be defeated allowed for the people of Medina to forge key alliances and convert many others to Islam. The next time Mecca attacked an ally of Medina, Muhammad's army was large enough to take over its rival city. Now with control over these two major cities, Muhammad's power was seen as a threat to both the pagan religions of the lands and to the independence of its people, so many anti-Muslim coalitions were formed. But these coalitions would be defeated time and time again, only facilitating the expansion of Islam by opposing it, as, when the Muslims conquered a major city, they would destroy idols of the local religions and forcibly convert the citizens to Islam. The power Muhammad held scared many tribes into submitting to Muhammad and Islam to simply avoid the horrors of war. Under Muhammad, his lands expanded to encompass the whole of the Arabian coast on the Red Sea and most of Central Arabia. Muhammad would soon pass, and his successor was somewhat controversial in Arabia at the time. But, in the calm before the storm, the Sasanian territories in Oman and Yemen that had recently gained independence were invaded and conquered. With these newly acquired lands, the Arabian Peninsula was now united under Muslim rule. But there was uncertainty to the validity of the first ever caliph, Abu Bakr. This led to an explosion of rebellion, with many claiming they only held allegiance to Muhammad, while others claimed to be rightful successors, or simply wanted independence. This instability placed the lands, now called the Rashidun Caliphate under Abu Bakr, in a precarious situation, with most of the territory in varying degrees of revolt. So, Abu Bakr conducted a campaign, in which he attacked the rebel armies all at once, so several rebels could not unify, and he would never expose the rear or flanks of an army by focusing on one group at a time. This proved to be immeasurably successful, and now there was political stability in the Rashidun Caliphate. With a strong home base, the Rashidun Caliphate exploded into the rest of the world, beginning the spread of Islam that would soon compete with the world's largest religions. And although being a newcomer as a global power, especially compared to its ancient neighbors, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire, the Caliphate was able to compete, and compete well. This is partially due to the war that had just concluded between the Sasanians and the Eastern Romans, that was unfathomably costly to both sides. On top of this, severe internal unrest shook the nations, so both empires were in a greatly weakened state. After many grueling years of brutal combat, vast swaths of land had been conquered from the Eastern Romans, and the Sasanians were completely wiped off the map. Soon, the Caliph Umar would pass away, and his successor Uthman would be elected. But Uthman had no experience leading an army or a nation. His expertise was in trading and financing, which under his rule greatly expanded the wealth of the empire. But due to his general ineptitude at leading, his family of the Umayyad clan were pulling the strings from behind the scenes. It was obvious to the people of the Caliphate that this guidance began a string of corruption, and so many began an open revolt against Uthman. These rebels sieged Uthman's palace and were able to sneak in and assassinate him. The new elected Caliph Ali was very popular amongst the common people, but as the governors of many provinces were Uthman's family, they greatly disliked him. The discontent towards Ali was greatly heightened among these officials, as he refused to persecute those who assassinated Uthman. The governor of Bilad al-Sham, Muawiyah, a relative of Uthman, led a rebellion against Ali, and after one decisive battle, Ali accepted to discuss an arbitration with Muawiyah, hoping to avoid further casualties of his countrymen. This decision by Ali was hated thoroughly by the people, and so a new civil war began, with even more rebels against Ali. Ali would be assassinated, and in hearing this, Muawiyah would march on the new capital of the Caliphate, at Kufa, to gain the allegiance of his former enemies and become the new caliph. As Muawiyah was part of the Umayyad clan, the empire was now called the Umayyad Caliphate. But his rule, and especially Muawiyah's succession, were hotly debated as to their validity. Muawiyah wanted his son Yazid to be his successor, and when the time came to elect his successor, Muawiyah threatened the lives of his council if they did not vote for Yazid. This was controversial for two reasons. One, in Arabic history, there was never a precedent for hereditary rule, and two, when Muawiyah was gaining support to become caliph, one of his agreements was that he would not push a successor. Soon, many key cities were in open revolt, primarily Medina and Mecca, and while Umayyad armies were crushing rebels, Yazid died. and his son, Muawiyah II, took the throne. By this time, the only major rebel army lay in Mecca, under the leadership of al-Zubayr. But, while Mecca was under siege, Muawiyah II passed away, leaving no real successor and general confusion, which forced the Umayyad army to return to Damascus. This allowed for al-Zubayr to conquer many lands, and several other revolts to spring up, all of which claimed a different ruler to the Muslim caliphate. It took many years before the nation would stabilize, but eventually, the Umayyad caliphs would put down the revolts, and finally have somewhat of a stable empire once more. But the caliphate was stretched thin, as they tried and failed to continue to expand in every direction, and due to a new hike in taxes, many revolts sprang up throughout the empire. Discontent was also sown among the people, as anyone who was not Arab was considered a second-class citizen. This didn't affect Saudi Arabia as much, as the land was mostly ethnically Arab, but it significantly mattered in parts of the caliphate where Arabs were a minority, or only a plurality, which gave rise to the Abbasid Revolution. Saudi Arabia was not as willing to join the revolution as other parts of the empire, with its majority Arab population enjoying their special social status. And eventually, the Arabian Peninsula was the final holdout for the Umayyad Caliphate. But these lands too would fall, as the Abbasid Caliphate was now in control of most of the Muslim world, and brought the lands into the Islamic Golden Age. Due to the general position and population of Saudi Arabia, the great scientific revelations of the time would rarely come from this region, especially as Mecca and Medina, the largest cities, were more religiously focused. This golden age would come to an end with a period of civil wars and unrest, where most of Saudi Arabia would declare independence in small tribes, which allowed for the Tulunids to invade Hejaz for a time, before the lands were quickly reconquered by the Abbasids. A later Abbasid-appointed governor of Egypt would rebel and control Hejaz, only to be usurped by the Fatimid Caliphate. Very soon after, the Ayyubid dynasty would be in control of the coastline. There is a long period of time now, where, under the Ayyubids, Hejaz remained generally stagnant, primarily being a location of worship. The Mamluks would rise to power, and would form strong relationships with the Arabian tribes on the fringes of their lands, to both secure their borders from raids, and to have a solid source of well-trained cavalry in times of war. As Europe began exploring the world, the Portuguese aimed to control the spice trade, in doing so, threatening and bombarding Mamluk cities in Saudi Arabia. This began a naval war between the nations, but as the Ottomans conquered the Mamluk heartland, this left Hejaz vulnerable to Portuguese raids. So as soon as possible, Hejaz submitted to the Ottomans for protection. These newly Ottoman lands were thoroughly protected by sea, but on land, the territory was subject to constant raids from nomads to the east. It didn't help that the power of the Ottoman sultans waxed and waned, leaving these fringe lands to be easily forgotten in the administrative hellscape that was Ottoman politics. Elsewhere, deep in the Arabian Peninsula, there was a clan gaining prominence in the city of Diriyah. This lineage would eventually produce Muhammad ibn Saud, of the House of Saud. At the same time, a Muslim philosopher, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, was expelled from his home after preaching a sect of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism. Wahhabism rejected the veneration of saints and worship of anything but God, and a firm fundamentalist understanding of the Quran. Bin Saud accepted al-Wahhab into Diriyah, and here the two men made oaths of loyalty to each other. Wahhabism was able to be freely practiced, and Bin Saud himself was convinced of its teachings. Now, Wahhabism gave Bin Saud an excuse to expand his influence, as those Muslims who reject Wahhabism are kind of not considered Muslim anymore in the faith. So with this, Bin Saud declared a holy war, or jihad, and began his conquest of Saudi Arabia, in the first Saudi state, the Emirate of Diriyah. In the expansion of their lands, the Dirians caused much chaos for the Ottomans by interrupting their caravans. In retaliation, the Dirians would soon be attacked by an Ottoman army that was sent to destroy them and put an end to the Emirate of Diriyah. But due to Bin Saud's military prowess, he was able to defeat the Ottomans, and then he turned his attention to the holy cities of Medina and Mecca. The Ottomans were busy elsewhere, and were not able to properly defend their lands. So, the Dirians were able to take control of the Islamic religious hubs and impose their strict Wahhabi beliefs on the cities. The Ottomans finally regrouped and kicked these new radicals from Hejaz. These forces then were able to push all the way into Diriyah and force the surrender of the emirate. The Ottomans didn't keep any lands that they had conquered besides Hejaz, as it was not worth the trouble to maintain. This allowed for the grandson of Muhammad bin Saud, Turki bin Abdullah bin Muhammad, to gain a power base in the city of Diriyah and expand his holdings as the Emirate of Nejd. The Emirate, however, could not take on Egypt, which now controlled Hejaz, for Nejd was in a constant feud with the Emirate of Jabal Shammar. This distraction with Jabal Shammar allowed for the Egyptians to conquer and install an Egyptian puppet ruler on the Nejd throne. This made an Egyptian military presence in Nejd constant, and allowed for them to defeat Jabal Shammar, until other factors forced the Egyptians to leave Arabia, leaving Nejd alone, but in control of Hejaz. This allowed for a non-Egyptian ruler to return to Nejd and control the emirate once again, but the unity of the lands could not last, as there were 2 civil wars over succession, which weakened the state enough for the Emirate of Jabal Shammar to take over. Around this time, the Ottomans reconquered Hejaz from these Arabs, and the Emirate of Jabal Shammar aimed for a friendly alliance with this powerful neighbor. The Saud family was exiled to Kuwait in their defeat, but Abdulaziz of the House of Saud, with only a handful of followers, left Kuwait and took over the city of Riyadh. From this power base, Abdulaziz rallied supporters of the House of Saud from the surrounding land, and mustered an army to retake the lands, formerly owned by his family. Abdulaziz was great at keeping morale high and supplies available, but his charisma could only do so much, as Jabal Shammar used their allied Ottoman troops to force the Saudis into a guerrilla war. As supply lines were vital in the brutal conditions of the Arabian desert, the Saudi forces were in a great position. Disrupting these supply lines both fueled Abdulaziz's forces and starved out the enemy. This fighting led to the acquisition of some land, and Abdulaziz felt confident enough to successfully attack the Ottoman lands along the Persian Gulf. This is where the British come in and have a meeting with Abdulaziz, making his lands, the Sultanate of Nejd, a protectorate of the British, and affirming many claims of the leader over the Arabian Peninsula, as long as Abdulaziz left other British protectorates alone. At the same time, the Sharif of Mecca was contacted by the British, and complied with them, once he found out he was going to be deposed by the Ottomans. So with the help of the British, the Sharif of Mecca declared an Arab state in the Kingdom of Hejaz, expelling the Ottoman Turks from the region. The Sharif claimed to be the king of all Arabs, which insulted the Saudi, who claimed most lands in the Arabian Peninsula, and after some heated negotiations, clashes began between these two nations. The Saudi were very successful in their campaigns, but as Hejaz was under British protection, the Saudi were forced to cease this war. But the British promised a unified Arab state to the Sharif, so when the Treaty of Versailles came around, and the lands promised for this Arab state were annexed by the British and French, the Sharif refused to sign the treaty. As a consequence for not signing the Treaty of Versailles, the British removed their protections from Hejaz, leaving the nation to their own devices. In the meantime, the Saudi had fully subjugated Jabal Shammar, and now, with a weakened and alone Hejaz, there was a new target of the Saudi. The ensuing war was fairly bloodless, with many towns and cities seeing the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Saudi army, and willingly surrendered. Some of the lands claimed by Abdulaziz were part of the British Empire, and the Ikhwan, a tribe of loyal warrior Arab people, wanted the Saudi wars to continue against the British to bring these claimed lands under Saudi rule. But Abdulaziz recognized British military supremacy and refused to declare war on the empire. Feeling betrayed, the Ikhwan rebelled, but these men would easily be cut down, as they preferred traditional weapons such as lances over guns and modern technology. Abdulaziz soon declared the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and would go on to complete his unification of the lands available to him. The kingdom's real boon came with the discovery of oil, which propelled the Saudi Arabian state to a regional power, with the amount of revenue from selling oil to the Allied powers, and allowing foreign companies to extract this resource. This is where we see the beginnings of American-Saudi relations, as together, they created the American-Arabian Oil Company. When the Second World War was nearly over, the Allies convinced Saudi Arabia to declare war on the Axis powers, but there was no point in sending troops abroad at this point, because victory was already assured. And Saudi Arabia was going through massive changes, as their population began to massively urbanize from the not-so-distant past of primarily pastoral tribespeople. And this change was clearly represented by a power struggle, resulting in King Saud, with strong ties to the tribes of Arabia, being ousted in favor of his more modernized brother, Faisal. Saudi Arabia gained a very anti-foreign interest demeanor when they were founding members of OPEC, began taking control from American oil companies, and during the Yom Kippur War with Israel, Saudi Arabia embargoed supporters of Israel. This embargo led to an energy crisis, skyrocketing the price of oil in the targeted nations. Despite all this, Saudi Arabia allied very closely with the United States in the Cold War, which allowed for them to modernize their army and have the financial support of the global superpower. During the following decades, Saudi Arabia would continue to improve infrastructure and modernize many parts of the nation. The ability to do this was almost entirely based on the Saudi oil reserves, and that Saudi Arabia became the top exporter of oil globally. With Iran's monarchy falling to revolution, the Saudi Arabian monarchy was terrified that those ideals would disseminate into their people, and the same violent uprising would oust them from power. This fear wasn't entirely unjustified though, as Iran was, in their words, exporting the revolution by funding Shia groups throughout the Muslim world to overthrow their local governments. On top of this, Iran now claimed to be the true Muslim state, which to the Saudi was preposterous, as they held Medina and Mecca, Islam's holiest sites. And this is where we see the rift between Sunni and Shia Muslims for the first time in history become violent, as Saudi Arabia would fund Sunni governments and groups, while Iran funded Shia. With the Arab Spring now in full swing, the Saudi Arabians were absolutely terrified of other monarchies and governments being overthrown by the people, and so Saudi Arabia sent aid to governments across the region, to varying degrees of success. There was now a rise of Islamists, who caused severe disturbances in the homelands, with some justified claims that the ruling house was spending exorbitant amounts of money, while the GDP of the nation stagnated and unemployment rose. The Islamists used the new commodified internet to spread their ideas in a nation where criticism of the government is illegal. The dissemination of these ideas led to mass demonstrations, which were severely resisted by the government. The anger of the Islamists in reaction to this began a wave of terror attacks. But the strong conservative values of the Saudi monarchy couldn't mask the fact that their people were very dissatisfied with their government. So to pacify them, liberal reforms would sweep the country, as women gained a few rights, and the first elections in Saudi Arabia were held for municipal governments, with the third municipal elections allowing women to vote. Nevertheless, the Saudi government holds strict control over its media, what the people are allowed to see and consume, with drugs and alcohol being illegal. Following an oil crash, Saudi Arabia vowed to diversify the economy so that they would not be as threatened by another inevitable crash. And as a leader of OPEC, Saudi Arabia began relations with other oil-producing nations to form OPEC+. OPEC+ was primarily to improve relations with Russia, but this relationship devolved. As oil prices plummeted with COVID-19 sweeping the globe, Russia refused a request by Saudi Arabia to slow down oil production. In retaliation, Saudi Arabia flooded the markets with oil, making the product essentially worthless. But Russia only increased oil production. So did Saudi Arabia. But after a market collapse for oil, and under the pressure of the United States, both nations reeled back oil production, returning it to somewhat normal rates. But either way, this will have deep and lasting impacts on the Saudi economy for decades to come. And that is the state of the nation of Saudi Arabia.